right, let's get started. Before James, before our dean introduces our guest speaker today, I want to let you know that the food is late. So we don't want to disrupt the presentation today, but the food will be available for all of you after the presentation. So it will be right up here. But it just didn't arrive. The second thing I want to say is that there will be a community panel on Wednesday at noon. The next thing is that tomorrow in 250 at 3:30 there will be a documentary being shown that Chaumtoli is going to tell you more about. And then finally, if you haven't signed up to spend some time talking with her, I think there are a few slots still available for you to spend some time with her. She is a New School alum, and she's a wonderful, wonderful person, and I encourage all of you to do so. So, Dean Hackman.
Hello, everyone. That's good. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be an inspiring presentation by the 2020 winter Daynard Distinguished Fellow, Professor Chaumtoli Huq. As many of you know, starting in 2004, the Daynard Fellow program was created with the generosity of Professor Dick Daynard and his wife Carol Daynard. Twice a year, the program brings nationally recognized public interest leaders to campus for a lecture, a roundtable panel discussion, and a series of individual meetings with students to explore how legal skills can be used to make the world a better place. Thank you, as always, to Carol and Dave. So, my assistant, Stephen Evans, gave me a bit of a bio on our speaker, but omitted the most critical fact for us here today is that she's actually a graduate of New School. So welcome back, and we're really eager to hear your words. But now she's actually joined the professorate. Professor Chaumtoli Huq is Associate Professor of Law at CUNY Law School and the founder and editor of an innovative law and media nonprofit focused on law and social justice entitled Law at theMargins. Professor Huq is a social justice innovator with extensive experience in movement lawyering, litigation, and public policy, mainly in areas of labor and human rights, both in the United States as well as South Asia, focusing on impacting low-income New Yorkers and workers in Bangladesh. In 2014, she was appointed as the General Counsel for Litigation for the New York City Office of Public Advocate and received the New American Heroes Award. She also served as director of the first South Asian Workers' Rights Project at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, as a Skadden Fellow, and as the first attorney to the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. In 2019, Professor Huq received the Access to Justice Leadership Award by the South Asian Bar Association of New York. In addition to all of her legal and policy endeavors, Professor Huq has produced 2 documentaries that tell the story of her work. As she stated in a Queen's Daily Eagle article about law at the margins, quote, "New voices lead to new perspectives on issues. New perspectives on issues lead to change in society. That's the power of narrative. You can tell a story that can impact the ability to obtain rights and justice," close quote. We're most definitely eager to hear Professor Huq's perspective. Please join in a warm round of applause.
So it's wonderful to be back home. This is my legal home. So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm going to be moving, I move. So I'm going to be moving back and forth to the PowerPoint. But I want to first thank Professor Daynard and his wife for creating this phenomenal opportunity for those of us who do public interest work to be able to share this work with sort of the next generation of movement lawyers who you are all that. And so it is really a treat. It's also very nice to be pampered, I have to say. And congratulations to Dean Hackney, who I remember as a new professor, and we all wanted to know this sort of 411 and new professors, what they're like, and I'm experiencing that myself right now. People are trying to find the info. Lucy Williams and the Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration is a new endeavor, and I'm really excited to see kind of what comes from that. There are numerous folks who are responsible for my visit. I see familiar faces, my classmate Dan over there in class of 97. Professor Shalonda Baker and Hemant Gunjaran was going to moderate a panel on Wednesday on storytelling and narratives for justice. The other plug I want to just make is tomorrow afternoon, I think it has maybe been put on the flyer, is we'll show our documentary on garment workers. And so it's an hour length, basically hearing from Bangladeshi garment workers in terms of organizing. So I really encourage you all who are interested in sort of narrative and media to come and join us for that, as well as our Emma and Hannah and our sort of student hosts for it. And I know I'm sort of forgetting folks, but thank you so much. I wanted to begin, I don't think I have a clicker, so hopefully you can see. Let me go backwards, sorry. I wanted to begin my talk with my passport, and not because I think I look particularly cute in that picture, which I do, but because I think it illuminates some themes about transnationalism that I want to bring to the fore in my talk today, and particularly in terms of how it relates to the arc of my career and this talk about transnationalism and movement lawyering. It wasn't until the summer of this year when I was in northeastern Bangladesh doing research on land grabs and tea workers that had noticed the locations, addresses of my passport that my mother had jotted down. The political climate in Bangladesh required me to kind of walk around with my passport, and in Q&A I can talk a little bit about that for those who are interested. But from where to where did I migrate? And so what was curious to me was that the address that was given in Bangladesh was actually my paternal ancestral village of Noakhali. I don't expect you to be familiar with that location. It's not the capital city. It's in the southeastern part of the country, located in the Bay of Bengal. This is the area from which, centuries earlier, seamen and peddlers would jump onto ships, and they would settle into parts of Tower Hamlets in UK, and they would also settle into parts of Harlem and Detroit. Vivek Bald has a phenomenal book called Bengali Harlem. It was also the location where immigrant detainees who were migrating up from Mexico found themselves in detention centers and kept there on allegations of terrorism. And so somehow this location of Noakhali, my ancestral village, on my passport carried some greater meaning. In fact, I was born in the capital city, but this error of decentering me from the capital to the periphery seemed to be significant for me. That's something that I had not noticed as a little girl, but caught my eye now as I began to reflect on my talk. My address in New York was in the Bronx. I grew up actually in the working class community of the Bronx. But that wasn't my first step into New York. It was actually Lincoln Center. Believe it or not, my parents, because of the 70s and what was happening in New York, thought Bronx was the better option. They weren't aware of gentrification that was to happen years later. So I start with these addresses because while they're not totally inaccurate, metaphorically, I think it signifies a lot about location, where we're from. And the fact that the two locations, for those of you who grew up in New York City know, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, was always considered the outer borough, the periphery, not really the center. And so that fact that I was imprinted so early on as the periphery being the source of my identity, I think informs a lot of the work that I do, which is to continually go back to the hyperlocal, go back to the communities that are oftentimes decentered and marginalized. So I wanted to start with that because it also brings up issues about transnationalism. So how am I using this word of transnationalism? To me, transnationalism refers to the links and interactions between people and institutions, historically, through memory, and through fact, the way in which I talked about the location of my ancestral village. It reflects a more complex, a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between people and institutions. It shows that law and culture is a lot more porous than the way that we talk about it in terms of the law. If we acknowledge that transnationalism provides a much more richer understanding of our lives and the communities that we seek to represent, then lawyering within that context means that we have to understand the intimate relationship between people and how systems of oppression or systems globally and locally are impacting on their lives. And so I think that will be a big sort of thrust of my talk today. And what I hope to do is through showing some cases, to kind of concretize that, and then to end with some reflections, some insights, not advice. I think one of my dearest mentors said to me, don't follow me. Don't listen to my advice. If you hear something that's resonant in what I say, then speak to that. And so hopefully this talk will do that. So for me, transnationalism and movement lawyering calls us to center people in our advocacy, to understand the systems that structure their lives. And so when you do that, you find that you're less invested on domestic, international, global, local. These binaries that we create in the law aren't actually how people live, right? We actually live transnational, complex, nuanced lives that can't be sort of sequestered by these artificial labels. Because transnationalism doesn't focus on the sovereign state, I didn't go from Bangladesh to the United States. I went to a hyperlocality to another hyperlocality with its own culture, history, and memories. And so this idea that you have to go outside of the country to do international work, to do human rights work, that human rights work happens in the global south, right? That is something that I hope to kind of shatter your notions of. Transnationalism, to me, reveals that socioeconomic processes, and because my focus has been predominantly around labor and employment, impacts our daily lives, impacts our localities. And so if we change the frame by which we think about our work, if we add this transnational frame, then perhaps what we will do is build robust grassroots advocacy and use our legal support work to do that. And we don't have to leave our block, essentially, right? Because in the Q&A, you can ask me sort of how I think that notion of going outside of your community is both classist, because who has the resources to do that, and also somewhat racist, because why would people who are growing up in marginalized communities want to leave it altogether? So that we can seek opportunities for solidarities and building community power. And to me, that's what movement lawyering is about. Building collective community power. And so I have come to this when I'm sharing much later. Earlier I ran into Professor Rowan, who I had taken a clinic with, and I thought my job was to tell you all the mistakes I've made so that you don't make it and you save a lot of time. And so I actually had bought into this notion of international or domestic, that I had to make a choice. Was I going to work in the United States, or was I going to return back, which I had always wanted to do, to my country of birth in Bangladesh, or work in South Asia and work on human rights. And as I began to sort of observe what was shifting in New York City, I saw that the Bangladeshi community in New York City was actually growing. In 1990s, the census study showed that Bangladeshis were the fastest growing Asian population in New York City. I was one of those statistically one of those community members. So I was observing this as I was growing up. In the 2000s, we saw that the US economy had experienced a change, structural change, that we went from manufacturing to a retail service industry and to predominantly low-wage jobs. And that you saw Bangladeshi immigrants entering to Asian immigrants, immigrant workers generally, entering into the service industry and low-wage jobs. And so as I moved my way through college and law school, and I observed the growth of this immigrant working class community, and I'll come back to how this has been structured by not just local national economic policies, but also what was happening in the restructuring of global capitalism, right, as well. So just from my vantage point of being in the Bronx or being in New York City, I began to see how these changes were happening. So just to kind of give you a flavor for it, this notion of migration of happening from one country to the other is also is really not entirely accurate. And I'm using the South Asian and the Bangladeshi community as sort of illustrative. I think that you can see some commonalities across other communities. You saw this push of in the early 2000s, the diversity lottery program. Bangladeshis were beneficiaries of that. So you had a push of immigrants coming into the United States, particularly Bangladeshi immigrants, as well as other Caribbean countries were beneficiaries of it. But they were coming into these retail jobs. But once they came to New York City, then they dispersed to other parts of the country. So moving from suburbs, so a lot of immigrants came in, Bangladeshi immigrants, for a button factory that was on the Hudson River, that then closed down, and then they transitioned to other jobs. So this kind of like idea that immigrants come from one place to the other, and they sort of fixed, captures these nuances of actually what's happening in terms of migration. I find the picture on the top really fascinating. Ultimately, Bangladesh is a very rural economy, and so in the urban setting of Buffalo, they have these vegetable gardens, and that gourd is like very much part of the diet. So even where people are going, there's sort of like ancestral DNA of like importing this like rural sort of agriculture into urban landscapes is really fascinating. We also have to recognize that they're entering into areas that have been disinvested by structural racism. It's not going to be part of my talk, but the role of immigrants entering into spaces, particularly in New York, now East New York, Buffalo, that have been blighted because of gentrification, because of disinvestment, and how it's sort of lauded as immigrants coming in, but we also have to understand at what cost. But again, just to show you the nuances that get lost if we have this sort of international, domestic kind of binary. So just to kind of move forward, as I moved my way through college, I began to observe the growth of organizing in the South Asian community. And so I proposed the South Asian Workers' Rights Project, and at that time I was very much discouraged. You're like, South Asian? I mean, why not immigrants? Why not a labor project? South Asian, that's so narrow, so kind of provincial. And so I'm really glad that I kind of stuck against, was a little stubborn. I said, no, this is a growing community who are being ignored and their needs are not being met. Of course, now we know that this is a large community that's being impacted also, particularly with the policies regarding the travel ban and all sorts of issues. So building the kind of infrastructure earlier on and noticing where the community needs are very key. This is a time when nascent organizing was happening around labor issues. And it was in that moment when the New York Taxi Workers Alliance is when I began as sort of a staff counsel. This is the same organization that by steadily building community power when the travel, we call it Muslim ban, was implemented and had one of the most momentous strike, withholding of labor for about an hour in opposition to this travel ban, that doesn't come about just out of nowhere. That comes about as a result of decades of local, steady, grassroots organizing, and it comes about because of lawyers providing that kind of steady and legal support. I'll go into that a little bit more. I'm gonna take my phone. One of my traits is I love to talk, so I want to make sure I allow time for time and questioning. So as I mentioned, I sort of bought into this domestic, international, but at the time, I did see this growing need. I saw that need because it was a community in which I grew up in and started this particular project. But it didn't mean that I had abandoned my interest and the connections between labor here and as well as labor in South Asia. So I wanted to tease out how I kind of began to understand some of these linkages through my casework. So I don't want to suggest that all of this was like fully formed. I know when you're in school, you're still sort of sorting that out. And so this is really as a result of engagement that I kind of come to some of these views. So so this is just a picture of Andolan, which is one of the early groups started to organize South Asian domestic workers. Unfortunately, this organization is now defunct. It was led by working class domestic workers, and I'll come to a point at the end of my talk about where we need, as lawyers, as movement-minded people, we have to support institutions and collective formations of working class people. And this to me is one of my sadness that organizations, if we look at the landscape that exists today and nonprofit groups, they do not promote and cultivate working class leadership, working class women's leadership. But the director continues to work, right? Because whether you're a 501c3 or not, if you're in the community, you always get a phone call. Those of you who are familiar with that work. So through Andolan, one of my first cases that I worked on, I had to go back and look at all my old pictures. So getting an opportunity to go back down memory lane. So my first major case through which I want to illuminate some of these themes around transnationalism and movement lawyering was representing a migrant domestic worker who was brought to the United States and was severely mistreated. Shamela had never worked outside of her home. She had only seen how friends in her rural village had gone abroad, made money, came back, and bought land and set up a home. And she thought by going abroad, she would be able to provide some financial independence for her family. She only agreed to go to Bahrain because she felt that culturally, being an Islamic country, that would be more similar to her own country. But when she got there, she was asked by her brother's employer to accompany him to New York City. He had gotten a diplomatic post. After being months of being mistreated, she then learned about a Bengali-speaking, she didn't speak English, vendor. Again, remember I talked to you earlier about the slow rise of the working class Asian community entering into the service sector, right? So as that is happening in the United States, you have this vegetable vendor who speaks Bengali. You have Shamila, who has come from Bahrain to the United States as a migrant domestic worker. She goes out on a very restricted visit with the madam of the house, and she hears her language. And so she retraces her step, and she asks the vendor and tells him what had happened. Well, for those of you who are familiar, most immigrant communities have an ethnic paper. The ethnic papers play this social service role. Well, it so happened that that paper then connected her to Andolan, which is the community-based group I mentioned, and Nahar Alam, which is the organizer. And she then connected to me, and we brought this case. So again, this informal network that had already been in place, that immigrant communities have always used, right? if we don't pay attention to that, we would have lost that opportunity to represent someone who was in need. So using a law and organizing model, we were able to obtain a settlement for her. We did not, and we still have not changed law and diplomatic immunity. We have made some changes with respect to Bill of Rights for migrant workers under that visa system. But one of the things that we did do, and I'll talk about this more on Wednesday about narratives and how narratives are so critical, is that people will say, oh, because she's Asian, that happens typically to Asian immigrant women because they're not as aware of their rights. Oh, Bahrain, oh, that's because Arab, soft Islamophobia, right? Well, it's the Arab employers that do this, right? And so what we did is we were very intentional. This is not about an Asian worker or an Arab employer or a Muslim, or it's about the Islamic labor system, which is now kind of taking also some traction. It was nothing about that. It's a system of exploitation of labor, of migrant laborers, and the system of diplomatic immunity that allows certain employers to mistreat their workers. By reframing that, we were able to actually connect her case to other migrant workers as well. And we were able to kind of push back against some of this exceptionalism that, oh, that happens over there. That doesn't really happen here. But one of the things I wanted to kind of connecting back to this theme of transnationalism is her story is actually not atypical of many migrant workers from Bangladesh. The push out from the rural to the urban to work outside is connected to the similar processes that was happening in Bangladesh around the development of the garment industry. And what I mean by that, countries like Bangladesh that have been formerly colonized and then kind of struggling to find their own sort of footing were oftentimes encouraged to use cheap labor as their source of economic development. And so I know here, when I took classes with Professor Carl Clare, we did a lot of critical theory, kind of criticizing the development theories and how that is actually destructive to the countries. But on one hand, you have the development of garment industry, and you have the push out of women as migrant domestic workers. And what I would suggest to you, those are the same related processes. And that countries like Bangladesh had to do that and were encouraged to do that because being agrarian and rural was actually considered to be backward. And so while women in the garment industry generated about 22 billion of US dollars into the economy, in remittances, like workers like Shamila, brought in 14 billion. Workers were brought all over the world. They were predominantly Bangladeshi women were, migrant workers were brought into parts of the Middle East, and these agreements were brokered by the state. The Bangladeshi government actually would enter into labor agreements that was lower than from other countries. So my point is that the role of the state as well. And so as lawyers, I know we're focusing more on the law, but analysis of the economic systems that impact our clients, but the role of how does the state function within that. And I think that's where, for me at Northeastern, taking classes like racism law or critical legal theory helped me to really understand what was happening in our clients' lives. Just to give you a kind of cautionary tale, if we didn't see this framing of how Shamila comes to New York City and is essentially rescued because of the migration of the working class Bangladeshi vendor, right? The encounter that they have are two sides of the same coin. Is everyone following me? And so that we need to kind of understand that. Also, how does Shamila come to me as also a migrant worker, right? So these are not coincidental or accidental processes. And so understanding kind of larger systems that operate on our clients' lives allows us to understand how does this particular person, client, come to arrive in front of me? And how can I then be able to serve them properly? If you don't do that, this is a cautionary tale. Years later, in 2013, the former Southern District U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara had arrested an Indian diplomat for not mistreatment, but falsifying documents regarding her Indian migrant workers. In that case, the lawyer did not connect with the community groups at all, didn't at all recognize the possibilities of any kinds of fallout because she was an Indian worker working for an Indian diplomat, and it was backfired, essentially. What happened is commentators in India were saying, oh, look at the big bad US. They were suing or arresting an Indian diplomat. And so in this whole narrative, the worker's story got lost. All because the advocate failed to connect with local community groups and saw the case purely as, oh, this is just a labor case. And so when we talked to that particular advocate and said, why didn't you contact anybody? They're like, oh, we had no idea there would be ramifications of suing or arresting an Indian diplomat in India. Really? Seriously? You thought that because you were working only in the United States, it would have no ramifications. It was the buzz in Indian media, talk show. And so this is sort of lack of awareness can actually hurt your client. Eventually, the diplomat was recalled, and the worker pretty much sort of subsided, didn't get really much of the benefit. So this is the cautionary tale of what I'm saying might feel like, oh, she's talking in the abstract. How does that relate to my day-to-day concretely in my advocacy? So one other example I wanted to show you in terms of transnational links, Zahida Begum is on the top, if you can see, founded one of the most largest garment worker federation in Bangladesh. It exists today. She was, I think, 12 years old when she entered into the garment industry to work. She then, because she experienced low wages, sexual harassment that continues to today, she founded this union. So it was a group of 4 women. But due to different personal circumstances, she found herself in the United States. And so I began to know her only through one of her co-founders. Hey, did you know that she was actually in New York City working as a home health aide? And so she is now working on an immigrant women's co-op. As someone who was a labor organizer and built institutions, even though her personal circumstances pushed her to come to the United States, she still had that collective framework, collective organizing idea, and built that up, and that's kind of happening today. So again, these connections we need to be able to see to be able to understand what are these larger socioeconomic policies that are processes that are impacting on our clients' lives and the communities that we want to serve. So for me, as a movement-oriented lawyer, we need to understand these trends so we can respond directly to that. And we can respond to it really thoughtfully, right? When I mentioned to you about the example of the Indian diplomat, not some narrow technocratic way, but actually to know how are these restructuring that's happening globally impacting our clients' lives. Even though in the more narrow case that you might bring, I'm not talking about transnationalism when I'm in federal court, right, representing the domestic worker, but I'm very much attuned to that in my organizing support strategy, right? Is everyone following? So in the narrow role that you're playing, you're doing the traditional lawyering that you're learning here at Northeastern. But what I'm saying to be the movement lawyer is to understand not only that legal role, but how does it connect sort of to broader? And so that you can then provide the legal support that is needed. I mentioned to you, I think, I say this today, I think all of the seminar classes, like if you have time, race in the law, critical legal theory, I don't know, whatever is offered, take that. Because I think more than anything, those classes that provided me the analytical tools to understand the work that I was doing, because the technical skills, you'll get it, you're all smart, you know, it's not like, I think we do worry when we're students, like, oh, I'm not gonna know how to file a case or do this. You'll get that, right? But it's the broader understanding of what's happening, the analysis that I think is harder. So for me, movement lawyering is distinct from public interest lawyering because it takes into account beyond the legal structures. It looks at how does socioeconomic systems impede mass-based mobilization. Because remember, for me, movement lawyering is about building political power. It's about using the law strategically and making the kind of interventions to support the political conditions for workers themselves to articulate their demands. You're not there to articulate their demands. You're not needed for that. But you are needed because you do understand the legal system, to provide the openings and to crack it open so that the workers themselves can articulate them themselves. And so how might you do that is kind of part of your training, I think. Organizers are looking for your skills in analysis. They want you to be the lawyer, right? They want you to do that work. And so I think kind of being, seeing and playing that role. I know sometimes lawyers feel like, oh, I don't want to take over. Don't worry. Like, organizers will put you back into your place. They'll tell you, no, I don't need to. There's so many times I've given advice to their taxi workers, hey, you know, if you're a non-union, if you do this strike, that might be an antitrust violation. Like, okay, thanks. They went ahead with the strike. So the point is, your job is to give the risk benefit for the organization. The other thing I think I've come to understand is we need to understand what does our work locally look like globally, and dare I say, we need to have a clear critique of global capitalism. The widening inequality that is happening in the world, particularly when you look at countries in the global south, when I look at garment workers and my current project on IT workers, the level of inequality is really astounding. And there's no other cause to that but looking at global capitalism. I think as lawyers, we need to develop practices to critique that. We need to develop practices that are anti-capitalist, and we need to be very clear about that. Because it's not going to be in the interest to really build collective power. Because when you look at the field of labor rights, we see the attack that is being done on any formations of collective power. It's not a surprise to me that unions and collective mobilization is being attacked. Because that's really where you build power. And so that's why, for me, I've always remained, or tried to be, in the area of labor rights. And we see that when communities mobilize, they actually can bring change. We've seen some great examples of this. In the food sovereignty movement, we saw groups like Via Campesina push the UN system to produce this new UN declaration on peasant and rural workers. We've seen the domestic worker mobilizing after a decade, create these conventions, ILO conventions on domestic workers. All of those occurred through outside mobilizations pushing on the legal system and pushing on the legal system to articulate new rights, not to enforce the rights that already exist, but to articulate new rights that really actually give them rights and dignity. So we do have actually examples that this is possible. And so it's really important that if we want to do people-centered grassroots work, we need to respond to where people are at. And doing the political work helps us to do that. I'm going to skip over some slides just in the interest of time, because I want to really open up for conversation and question. So this is an example where these are in rural Bangladesh. I'm showing a documentary called Claiming Our Voice. It's a great documentary on domestic worker organizing in New York City to women in rural areas who might go out and become domestic workers. And they were surprised about the mistreatment of workers in the United States, because they thought, oh, in America it's like, you know, land paved with gold. And they were also particularly impressed with how women were organizing, women like themselves. So we need to do these kinds of cultural work as well. And that's why much later in my career, I made this shift to, not because I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I worked with a filmmaker, because I saw the importance of narrative, that I was coming against a barrier, that unless I changed the narrative around some of the communities I cared about, issues I cared about, and did the political work, none of this is going to change. So at this point, so we need to be attuned to where the shifts in global culture are happening. And so this is something I feel like I benefited from in college, is study groups. Do people do that now? Not law study groups, political study groups. You get together and you look at texts, you look at thinkers, activists, revolutionaries, and you get to draw some lessons from that. So I was very lucky that in college I had a political mentor that's who I would go to, like, what's happening? I don't really understand. And so we need to actually create more of a kind of Freirean kind of public political education and consciousness. I encourage that with my students to sit. You don't have to have the faculty be involved. Have critical study groups to look at thinkers, what has been done before, what could be, because some of these systems of repression, they just find new ways, but they're kind of similar in the way that they operationalize, and so be able to understand a little bit of that. So that's my little plug about how that's important. So I want to spend just very quickly a little bit of time to talk about the shift in culture that's really important. So hopefully in the earlier, talk about how socioeconomic processes impact our client work, how that's important. And so now, how culture is so important. So most recently, Trump has extended the countries that are included in the travel ban. I call it the Muslim ban, because essentially that's what it is. It is targeting Muslims and heightening the level of Islamophobia. And so I think that we need to also have a sharpened critique of Islamophobia. We see that in South Asia and India right now, and I think that we're sort of a little bit at a loss of trying to understand these processes that are happening globally. So what's happening in the United States, the exclusion of citizenship, has a relationship to the boldness of Modi and India to exclude Muslims, right? The Rohingya genocide, crisis. These are things that are symptomatic of Islamophobia which we have to really address. But when post 9/11, we didn't have really, when I say we, I mean collectively a whole host of organizations didn't have the infrastructure to respond adequately. So these two cases I remember right after 9/11, one on the Shifa Siddiqui, who's still incarcerated. He was an American-born Muslim who was kidnapped from Bangladesh. So kidnapped under the direction of the United States, because there was collaboration amongst the states for allegations of providing material support to tourism on very weak evidence. Similar in Tashnuba, one of the first cases, her and a Ghanaian sister, teenagers were the first minors charged with terrorism based on their speaking to a particular Islamic cleric, no other evidence, a teen charged with terrorism. So at that moment, what we did is we responded, we raised awareness. Some of you may also remember special registration. Does that ring a bell? It's a process by which certain individuals, again, predominantly Muslim countries, were asked to appear to ICE. And if they were without papers, they were oftentimes put into deportation proceedings. It was a process by which essentially it's a dragnet. And as a result of that, Olga did a report that the vast majority of the people that were deported or impacted were working class South Asians and Muslims. Many actually didn't go, and then they remained in the United States and then became caught up in the Trump's sort of policy around immigration. So what we learned from that was that we need to build up infrastructures and networks to be able to support communities. We were just responding right at that moment. And so kind of the lesson learned from that is it's important to build informal networks. It's important to build transnational networks so that when Tashnuba is returned back, she takes voluntary departure, goes back to her home country, there's a support system there to be able to kind of support individuals. And so for that, we need to actually have a coordination across the borders. And I think some of this comes through experiences and the ideas through engagement. But the key part from the takeaway from me was really shifting towards, initially part of my career was representing individuals and fighting for rights. But then there was a moment where I shifted to thinking, no, well, what am I fighting for? And what am I building towards? And so I think that part of the skill set that I think is also really been important is building the frameworks that you want to see based on the vision that you have. Thankfully, there's been this movement towards community economic development programs in clinics and law schools that give us students those kinds of tools. I'm going to skip over. These are some cases of where, because a lot of the men were deported in the first wave of special registration, what you saw is that the women then became active as activists or remained in the United States. So when Trump did an aggressive enforcement, you saw a lot of women then get caught up in the deportation regime. But this time, because we had built infrastructure, we had some support mechanisms in place to support them. I talked already about the taxi strike and how the sort of the solidarity across race and class was so critical. That 1 hour that the drivers struck in support, in opposition to the Muslim ban, was a powerful moment because it also shed light on Uber and Lyft and these gig economies, and it really solidified the connections between race, class, and global solidarity in a way that we hadn't been able to do before. So understanding how these connections are made allows you to kind of make these kind of strategic interventions, right? So building this transnational advocacy networks, I think even if the entire part of your career is going to be local, and I would suggest shortly that build from where you are at. Don't necessarily look outwards in terms of what the work that you want to do. I think this youth organizers quote is really important. This is a protest that happened in 2013. Some of you may know a building collapsed in Bangladesh called Rana Plaza. In that building there were garment factories that produced for a lot of the major brands, Gap, Walmart, and so that revived a whole global sort of attention to sweatshops and global labor. And so the Bangladeshi and the South Asian youth diaspora here protest in front of H&M, right? And this is like young people, like high schoolers, right? Who are growing up in this sort of new activism, then sort of see these connections, which I think is like so phenomenal that they're seeing that so earlier. So there's a quote from Jensen. She's also part of this short documentary I did about Bangladeshi women and organizers, is to recognize that their struggle is ours, not only because we're part of the diaspora, because they are working women and exploited by capitalism. So that seeing her own positionality as a working class youth in New York City, right? Not, oh, poor exploited people over there, from a positionality of, hierarchy. But by saying, I'm also impacted by classism as a working class youth. This is also, she's also a youth that went through school safety officers, right? The school to prison pipeline. So she's experiencing how policing intersects also with working class youth, and seeing the connection to a garment worker in Bangladesh, not around the issues of how they're exploited kind of globally, right? That positionality to me is really key. So as we make these links, solidarities emerge. What's the purpose of all this? It sounds great. I guess I would suggest to you is by making these links, by seeing these connections, you're able to do as Jensen does, to forge these solidarities, to provide support to movements from wherever you are. You don't necessarily have to go to Bangladesh to support the garment workers there. There's a role that you can play, that you can do that here. You should feel less oh, I should be there. You should feel more like, how can I deepen my work where I am at? There's no choosing here or there. But what I would suggest to you is to deepen your work and that may change for you based on your individual choices of where you find an affinity, an issue, a locality, but build from where you are at. Build with people around you, right? And so I think that if you begin to do that and keep this transnational frame in your work, you will then begin to see invariably all of these connections. I wanted to now kind of end I'm reading back again Grace Lebach, who is an Asian American activist who did just that, who rooted herself with activists in Detroit and really built with movements from where she located herself. And she had two quotes that I think kind of speaks to what much more articulate than I'm trying to say, which I think captures what I'd like to convey. So one is, she has a quote, the most radical thing I did is to stay put, right? And so from where you are at, from the communities that you seek to serve, the people with whom you want to build relationships, so build that. Offer your skills and support to that. The other is, this is a little bit career, because I oftentimes get questions, and hopefully the 2 days that I'm here, you'll come and sit with and talk with me one-on-one, is I want to make a distinction between, well, let me read her quote first, and because I think that sometimes we conflate our job and our work. And so what she says is that work is your calling in life. It's your purpose. Jobs are specific tasks that you do. I think in law school, we focus a lot on the task you should do. Like, what organization should you get a job from? Like your resume, all those are important. I don't want to minimize that, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I think in there we lose, and we focus predominantly about being good technicians of law, but perhaps the place where I think we can do a little bit more thinking, more provocation is around your vision and imagination. And I think I was talking to someone earlier, is around creativity. What is it that you're fighting against, and what are you building towards and for? What does that look like? And to grapple with that, I think, is really important. And so for me, that has looked differently over the course of my career. I've litigated cases. I've worked in government, mostly because I saw government as I mentioned to you, as a potential actor in creating rights. And so that was really important. Research, my work that took me to Bangladesh was predominantly research and advocacy to look at the labor movement there after the collapse of Rana Plaza. And so the arc of my career has been all over the place. And I'm not gonna lie, there are some days where now I have some benefit of a certain number of years to look back. But when I was in it at the moment, I thought, oh gosh, you can't make a decision. You're here and they're everywhere, And even well-meaning, loving friends would say, oh, what is she doing now? Like, she's just all over the place. And I think that at that time, definitely, I felt like, oh, I didn't really have a clear vision or idea of where I was moving towards. But I feel like now there was actually some clear things that I was operating or values that I was operating in terms of moving towards certain work. So I wanted to end today with a couple of things that I feel has been consistent. That although I moved in different jobs, right, as tasks, if you will, as Grace Lee would say. But my larger calling and purpose has been consistent. And that larger purpose and calling has always been about building power for those who are marginalized from our system. And so within that, there are a couple of principles that have really guided my decision-making, and I wanted to just share that with you, and maybe they will resonate. One is use law as a strategic tool to create the legal, social, and economic conditions so that those who are marginalized can articulate their own demands and their own rights. Decisions have to be made by those who face the brunt of that decision the most. That has been consistent throughout my career. There are tensions as a lawyer to do that. I have a funny story. In my early case, I was representing a group of drivers, and I was like a newbie lawyer, trying to establish my cred in federal court. And I get a call from the magistrate and said, Ms. Huq, your client is here in my chambers. I was like, did I miss a court date? No, he just went to court because, he had gone with me in other hearings, and I had always insisted on, not routine matters, but for key matters to have clients be present in my cases if they can afford to do that. And so he thought he had something to say to the court. So he had some thoughts he wanted to share. I was mortified because that meant what? I wasn't controlling my client. I didn't know what I was doing. And so I thought that it looked badly to me. And that's how I immediately felt at that moment. But I thought, you know what, why not? Why not? Why shouldn't he, because he wanted to share something with the judge, couldn't he do that? And later I had to say, hey, that's not going to be helpful for our case. I had to do some counseling. However, I thought that that was really a powerful moment for me to realize that if I really believe what I say, then I have to be comfortable with the chance that I might look a little bit like she doesn't know what she's doing, right? Meaning I can't get too comfortable with trying to establish myself in front of these powers that be if I'm committed to giving my clients the voice. Eventually, the judge, when the case settled in front of my clients, did say some really nice things. So I got redeemed a little bit. The second is defend those communities when they're attacked as a form of community defense. We have a powerful public defense system, which is based on the individual. But when we looked at post 9/11, the entire community was demonized. And so we had to kind of think about how can we collectively defend the community. And this may mean you will be sitting next to someone who is deemed a criminal. In Shipa's case, it was very hard when his mother and sister came to Brooklyn, because that's when a bail hearing was, to find anyone that would host them. And so movement lawyering meant they stayed in my one-bedroom New York apartment, and people feared, oh, the person who was being charged, their son, was being charged with terrorism. But I couldn't think about that fact, right? The fact was a mother and the sister needed a place to stay as their son was being charged with this crime. So really defending the communities that are attacked. Being mindful of the narratives we use to mobilize, and I talked a little bit about that, about narratives, and I'll talk more on Wednesday, to advocate for justice. For example, when we say America's the land of immigrants, no, that's not true. Stop saying that, because it involves the erasure of a brutal history of slavery in the United States, forcible labor in the United States, and so it promotes a narrative at the exclusion of other communities. 4, work with community-based organizations that have mass-based mobilizing as their mission. There are a lot of organizations doing good work, and all should be supported. But in terms of movement lawyering, for me, it's important to work with organizations that believe in the collective power, membership, and mass-based mobilizing. Allocate resources towards groups that do that community-based work, away from organizations that are relying too much on corporate philanthropy. They can get their money. I mentioned to you earlier on the line, these worker groups that are working class led are closing. They don't have resources. They're run volunteer. If you have a dollar of resources to spare, put your time towards them. Build up those organizations, because those are the organizations, right? How I came to know Shamela is because of Andalan. And so when immigrant communities are looking for support, those are the groups that they're looking towards. Build informal transnational links, networks. 7, build relationships with people, not organizations. Create your own support network, because this work is hard. I think that we try to glamorize it, but this work is hard. And sometimes you may take positions that aren't necessarily the same position as your classmate or your colleague, but you have to struggle together through those particular differences of strategy. And create your network that can kind of sustain you. This is not kind of a job for a limited time. This is something, for me particularly, is kind of as Grace Lee Boggs talks about, a calling. And then the last thing is something that I'm always kind of amazed of social justice or movement people, is believe that you can actually change things. Believe that radical social transformation is possible. And I think that sometimes we are so afraid that everything is so horrible and that we can't sort of fight against what's changing, that we can't see that change is actually possible and radical social transformation is possible. But you have to honestly believe that people collectively mobilizing can transform our society. Because if you don't have that initial confidence in terms of the communities, it's going to show up in terms of your work. In my 20s, I was always told when I was around law school, oh, you're too idealistic, impractical, and just wait till you get older. And so now I'm older. And so I still have been consistent. I still have been really privileged and honored to be able to do work that I think is my calling, and I'm really excited to share that with you, and thank you for bringing me here today. Yeah, let's open up for questions. Yeah, I wanted to give time for questions. Any questions about anything? Also, something I didn't talk about, it's fine. Who's shy?
I have a question. So you previously discussed the relationship between organizing and lawyering. And so I know that a lot of organizers push against the law.
Yes.
They believe that it's enforcing conflict secretaries and that their role is to not be involved in such cases. And so, as someone who I think has been involved in both, I was wondering if you have any mechanisms for balancing the two, or existing both simultaneously for managing.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that the existing legal structures are not necessarily going to bring the kind of respect and dignity, at least in the communities aspire towards. So there is that tension. So what you're saying about organizers sort of pushing back on lawyers. But I do think that the way that I look at my role is that it's the community defense aspect, is communities that are under attack in different ways. Some are slower. Poverty is a slow attack, right? Or more overt, right? This deportation and detention. Your legal strategy can provide a certain level of breather, a room, a buffer. So all the challenges and litigations on the travel ban, I wasn't involved in that, but provided on the community side. The community organizers' response was, okay, now we can mobilize our communities. We can also help communities to prepare. So for example, if they're going to be deported, they can make their arrangements in terms of being here, family and stuff. So I think that there are sort of specific roles that lawyers can do play with respect to organizers. And so litigation, I think it's, bringing cases for back pay, a lot of the wage cases, the migrant worker cases, settlement. Those are important because if you just did the law part of it, but there wasn't a mobilizing part of it, then I think the impact would be less. But I think where there was a synergy was when you worked with community-based groups, they identified certain cases, and then they would mobilize around that case. They might use political awareness around a particular case to raise some issues around immigrant workers or whatever the issue may be. So sometimes there is a synergy, but sometimes you may not have a role in terms of a formal legal role. And so in that way, your work might feel more like a social work organizer. And so I think for me, for movement lawyering is actually the span of that kind of work. And sometimes your work doesn't look like traditional legal work. And sometimes it may look like more of a social work, organizing work as well. But that's also important because you have an understanding of how the legal structure operates. You know, this is where legal theory, where the gaps are, so you can kind of push on those gaps to kind of really open up the system. That's something you know as a lawyer. And that's kind of your contribution to the work. Like, where could we bring a case, or maybe we can bring this, raise awareness. You know, we're not necessarily going to be successful, right? But media pays attention when a lawyer files a case. We're going to use that, use our privilege of that. I'm not saying do anything that court, no rule about sanctions, but you bring that to open up. So there are different strategies you can use if you work in tandem with a community-based organization. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
I was wondering, so I think what you're talking about as far as changing what your idea of what a lawyer does, beyond classically understood legal work, and also understanding where legal work has its limits. In my experience, it's very hard to figure out what exactly are your boundaries when you're blurring those lines. And I'm curious to hear your advice or experience about also having healthy boundaries for yourself and not taking on too much work when you're doing that.
So I'll answer the first part. The healthy boundaries it's a constant negotiation of I think when I enter into a work, I'm very clear about what my role is going to be in that space, and I make it clear to the organization. Am I in this capacity as a lawyer, or am I in this capacity as one of a community, right? And so my being very clear about what your function is going to be for yourself, I think is really important. And so I found that very helpful because sometimes in some larger campaign work, so for example, one of the groups I work with in New York City, it's called DRUM, it's a South Asian working class organization. And so they have been working with hunger strikers from South Asia. And so in that time, my work I wasn't the attorney of record on that. But there was a lot of questions about how is it that all of these South Asian migrants were coming up through Mexico and landing in detention centers at the border, and what was happening there. And so in that that instance, for example, my role was to actually explain what was happening in South Asia that was pushing out individuals and why people were making the precarious journey because other outlets had been closed. And so there my role was just really kind of giving the broader political perspective. And I knew that was my role there. So I think in terms of being very clear about your role, I think is very helpful, because sometimes if you you're there as a lawyer, but then you're giving sort of other kinds of advice. I think there's where the tension can come up. And respecting the organizations, their processes, I think is really important. So one thing that's helped me is just really having a clear idea of like what my role is. I think second is doing the continual daily practice of just humility, right? I think, I think a student, I think, helped me to like finish this phrase. You're important, but you're not the point, right? And so meaning that your role and your contribution, I don't subscribe to some of the literature on public interest lawyering, which is subordinate yourself, and you do whatever the community says, because the community is varied and has so many identities, and also I'm part of that community. I have a stake in the community in which I was raised. I also think that framing, to be very blunt, is an outsider framing. It's a de-raced framing. It anticipates the lawyer is not a person of color, is not a working class person from the community in which they're serving. We can talk offline about that. So I don't think that movement lawyers should be outside of the community. However, you do have certain privileges. You do have certain access to the system for which you have to do a daily practice of checking yourself, like checking your own privilege. When I do research now that most of my research is now in Bangladesh, sometimes it will be very easy because I speak the language, I was born there, to play that card and say, oh yeah, I'm from here, I'm just like, no, I grew up in New York City, right? For the most part, the bulk of my years are here. My experiences are not the same as even a middle-class woman growing up in Bangladesh. It's just not the same experiences. So checking my own self, that's something internally. That's what your support group will do, to check yourself, like, hey, you went a little bit over. So that's the second part. And then in terms of boundaries, I think it's a continual struggle for me personally but this is my work. This is kind of what I decided to do. And so I think there's a lot of conversation around self-care. So I go back to the ways in which immigrant communities have done self-care, which have always been collective. Meaning, the way we talk about self-care is like you extricate yourself, you leave your community, and you go to a spa or something, right? For me, collective care might involve a meal with my friends. So one of the things I actually do is I regularly host salons in my apartment and have food, and we just talk. And for me, that's like feels connected, supported. There's like laughing, sometimes there's poetry readings. And so the idea is that I don't need to leave my work to re-energize myself. I just need to kind of surround myself by people who replenish me to feel re-energetic. So that has worked for me. You might want to, different things work for different people. And even for today, I was asked, in the scheduling, I need downtime. I'm speaking now, but I'm a classic introvert. I need downtime, right? I need to just like be in my space. I need to kind of like dream. I love music. I love dancing. Like I need to do my own thing. So like finding the things that like give you joy and guard that. Like, some mornings I'm just like listening to my jam. I'm not doing anything, right? But that is essential for my care. So figuring out what might be helpful. I don't know if that spoke to what you wanted to. Thank you. It can also be comments. It doesn't have to be a question. Yeah. Or you can also disagree.
I don't disagree with anything you said.
Okay, too.
I have a question about talking about defending your community within the system of like a courtroom and how you represent certain cultural differences in that space that is incredibly white, incredibly capitalistic, incredibly normative.
Yeah.
And like how do you spend time building the case for your individual client, also building a this way you can make it sometime.
Yeah. You're like, let me just drop that question. Let me try to, yeah, I think that, well, just as a, as a woman of color, I mean, still the statistics on like women of color, women in law and litigation is like very few. So just stepping into the courtroom, I mean, it's been a few years that I've been actively practicing since I left the public advocate. But, even being senior, I remember going in with my law intern, who's, taller, white male, and the civil court judge was looking at him and saying, counselor, like, ready for the case. Now, thankfully, and that's why he's like now a dear friend of mine, and so he's like, Judge, she's the lawyer, she's my supervisor, like, kind of highlighting so there's that piece of it, of just having to navigate personally, just going in and fortifying yourself into spaces that are not made for you, that are not set up for you to exist, that are not made for you to speak up. In New York, you still go in and on the walls, it's like, forget about, it's all men, and so that, building up the strength for that, I think having the support network is key, but that's the interpersonal part. And so the larger part that you're talking about is navigating kind of your representing an individual client and then the community piece. Recently I've had this kind of unique role in a criminal case, an individual, a woman who, she's an immigrant, Bangladeshi, who, because of postpartum depression, threw her child out the window. So she was criminally charged with homicide, and she had a public defender. So she had hired a private defender, and so after a year, the husband had somehow, again, back to those community networks, and I was like, how did you find me? Said, sister, I really need you to help me navigate the system. And what I realized was that I sort of then in that role inserted myself as kind of like this, I don't know if there's a good term for it, this quasi-advocate that was very familiar with the legal system. But there was, one of the reasons she began to talk is, and this might be familiar for those who are Muslim, is that she saw the spirits, the jinn, and she was talking over her, and that she had been very superstitious, but it was a combination of postpartum, but also being articulated through her words and her lens. And so I accompanied the psychiatrist, who was actually very sympathetic, African-American psychiatrist, and he was like, I don't really understand that. And so at that moment, I had to do precisely that. I was like, well, I don't want to sort of essentialize all Muslim women, in this way. But I also knew that the way in which she was articulating her sadness had this kind of cultural lens to it. And so I did share, these are the reasons why she's talking about that. And so there was a meeting later with the district attorney, and there was a similar, really demonizing, it's women who are incarcerated, just generally, I feel like our sexism in society, we're not supposed to be committing crimes that are already demonized, and a woman who has, accused of killing her infant is even further kind of just seen in this particular way. And the district attorney on that case, and this is in Queens, and it's a large immigrant community, was like, well, who will look out for the right of a child, right? And who was making this sort of grandstanding kind of comments. Now, mind you, her husband got if there's more men like this, right? He could have very easily just dropped her, right? They're a newly couple. He could have just, he's very religious. He would go every single visitation hour to see her, the Rikers. So he was there at all of the hearings. And I said, no one more than he and the mother are thinking about the child every single moment. Like, so you don't have to you don't have to advocate for the child here. She made a mistake that was related to certain mental illness for which she shouldn't be penalized. So I think, I mean, there's more to say in that story, but I think in that moment, I did make a kind of calculated decision that it was important to do this sort of cultural translation, even though at the risk of perhaps sounding a little bit essential, because her attorney really had he was just treating it like, okay, this is the best we can get, so eventually she was then, they entered a plea that resulted in her getting psychiatric care versus being incarcerated. And she was also not a citizen, so there was immigration consequences as well. So I think that was a struggle for me a lot, right? It was a struggle on so many levels as a mother, I'm a parent. And so just kind of navigating your individual values, but ultimately she should not be in prison. She should not be in prison. And I think that for me was kind of really tapping into the more, the most sort of spiritual kind of value, like all human beings deserve dignity. And if I really believe that, if I truly, truly believe, if I practice what I preach, then I should be her greatest advocate. And so, anyway, I don't know if it really gets to what you're saying, but I think those are the kind of tensions you just kind of work through. But I think that's why it's so essential to have the diversity of the profession. Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much, Chaumtoli, for being here, and she's here for 2 more days.
Yeah.
And since we have not let people know about the documentary that's going to be shown
Sure.
tomorrow, unfortunately, my Fed Courts class meets at exactly that time. But for the 1L classes, can someone announce in each of